Welcome to OmniTalk, powered by Nexoft. I'm your host, Amy Rice, and OmniTalk is a podcast focusing on fintech and how it affects banks and credit unions. On today's episode, Tom Parsons talks about Cecil in detail. He explains what it is, the implementation timeline, and what you should be looking for when vetting a vendor. I'd like to welcome Tom Parsons to the show. How are you doing, Tom?
Doing really well, Amy. Thanks for having me today.
We're happy to have you on. As you know, today's episode is all about Cecil. Cecil is kind of like a rainy day fund. Could you explain more about that and also what changes banks and financial institutions will have to make in order to implement Cecil?
Sure, and that would be a great way to explain it to somebody who's not familiar with banking. So if I make a loan and it pays off on time, in my car loan, let's say, for 5 years, it pays off over time and always on time and then pays off, well, that's great. Well, what happens is, let's say 3 years down the road, the person loses their job or something happens and we're going to take a loss on that loan because maybe we have to repossess a car or maybe we got to, whatever. Well, so then what the bank has to do is at the time of that loss, they have to reserve. They have to take money out of their capital and put it into a reserve that helps pay for losses like that. So it reduces their capital. Well, a bank, the way banks make money is they lend out funds. And if you take that pool of money out of the capital, out of the available lending pool, well, then they don't make money on that. And so here's where Cecil kind of handicaps a banker, where before a banker could wait until something went bad in order to reserve for it. Now they have to calculate what they think or expect their loss to be and take that up front. So now for the entire length of that loan, I've got to hold back a certain percentage in reserve for possible losses. Well, think about that. If a banker wants to make loans and that money is not available for lending because it's in reserve, well, you're going to make less money. So there's an impact to the impact to the financial statements, impact to the income statement. And so that's why it's a controversial method, and it's an accounting method. It's not going to determine whether you're going to fail or not.
Cecil has been delayed a few times since its initial announcement. Can you talk about what that means for banks and credit unions?
Because it has been put on hold for about a year, I think many listeners have forgotten about Cecil or at least mentally wanted to get away from Cecil because it was a sore spot for many. But yeah, a year ago, the joint agencies decided to delay Cecil, and Cecil is current expected credit loss. And so it was supposed to be implemented, or banks were supposed to be compliant in January of 2022, but they pushed that back another year. So the official start or compliance date is now January 1st, 2023 for most institutions. That would be remaining institutions. There are some larger institutions that have had to implement Cecil already, but those are very large, publicly traded institutions. And something to also point out, because what we're going to talk about a little bit today, I imagine we're going to get into the joint policy statement, but this is not something that was dreamt up by the FDIC or the NCUA or the OCC or the Fed. Those are all regulatory agencies, but this is the Financial Accounting Standards Board. This has become GAAP accounting, and so it's as if the agencies have to comply with FASB. Over the years, FASB has made some pretty unpopular decisions about accounting, including FAS 115 and some other accounting standards that require banks, thrifts, financial institutions, credit unions to do some pretty unusual accounting on different instruments on their balance sheet. The FDIC has had to kind of navigate what this all means, understand it, and then decide when it's going to be implemented.
You mentioned the joint agencies. They just released a policy statement on CECL. Can you bring us current on that and what it means to the CECL timeline?
Like everything in the regulatory world for financial institutions, the joint agencies, being the Fed, OCC, the FDIC, and the NCUA, will come together on big decisions and decide jointly, that is, that they're going to enforce and apply certain guidelines or guidance across all financial institutions. So where credit unions and banks have a fundamentally different way of managing themselves and a different balance sheet composition, they're still going to have to apply certain techniques or methods because the agencies got together and decided that they should. It was interesting as the first the first policy statement was made available back in December, and it was out for comment, meaning that banks and credit unions had the opportunity to question items within this document. The recent release, the policy statement that came out in May, says that they only received 23 letters from trade associations, banks, and credit unions asking for clarification or questioning certain pieces of the policy statement. So on the one hand, you have an industry who's questioning and kind of resisting the implementation of CECL. But when it comes down to taking action and actually maybe showing their voice towards the opposition, only 23 letters actually came in. Now, of course, I haven't seen those letters. It could be that numerous banks got together and issued one letter. I don't know. But it just seemed like a low number to me. Nonetheless, it came out and it was published in May, and it clarifies everything that they're going to enforce in the when CECL actually rolls out. And one of those things is that it will be enforced January of 2023. So I think the main thing here is that, yes, it was delayed a year ago. I think that banks, thrift credit unions were hopeful that it would just be delayed again and again until it finally died a slow death and that's simply not the case. It is going to be rolled out. It is going to be required in January of 2023 for the remaining financial institutions.
What are some considerations financial institutions should be aware of when thinking about CECL?
Well, there could be a number of different items here. The biggest is data, and I fear that there are a lot of people who are well-intentioned in wanting to help organizations like banks and credit unions to implement systems like CECL, and everybody has a different view of what's right and what's wrong. But with CECL, this is brand new, and nobody really knows what is ultimately the most appropriate method. The only thing we can say is that a bank or a credit union needs to implement a method and a level of data, and I'll get to data in a second here, that is appropriate for the size and complexity of their organization. So for most organizations, our view is that summary information is best, and here's why. So you have a choice. In order to calculate the credit loss, you need to have loss rates. You need to have historical information. So you can gather that historical information from a number of different places, but the two primary places are the loan system itself, and the second is from a download of your data from the FDIC or from the NCUA in the form of your call report. So every call report filed since as long as we know has included information about what the loss rates are for the various types of loans, the various segments of loans in the organization. Well, where did that data come from? It came from the loan data. So if, in theory, if you were to take an extract of data, loan data, dating back, say, 10 years on individual loans, and trace those loans over time through good and bad and through losses, the total losses of those individual loans would add up to what you filed in your call report. So they're going to match. The question we have is, well, why go back through all the trouble of gathering all that detailed loan data if you already have it in a summary form? And there could be reasons why you need to or want to. But here's the first roadblock. Most organizations don't even have that data. A lot of organizations have detailed information on their loan portfolios dating back as maybe 5 years at the most. A lot of our organizations go through core system conversions, and they typically lose all that data when they do a core conversion. So where are you going to get the loan data if that's what you're going to use? And then why would you use loan data? Well, here's why. If all of your loan data is going to roll up into one of, say, 13 different categories in the call report, well, then if you use call report data, the level or the most detail you can get is at that call level. So you have 1 to 4 family first is a category, and certain loans roll up into that. Well, if you felt that you had a different loss rate between certain loans that all rolled up into the same category, then you would need loan level information in order to decipher what portion of that 1 to 4 family first was losing at a certain rate versus another rate. So unless you had to segment your loan data into greater detail than what's already existing in the call report, then it becomes unnecessary to go through really the pain of trying to find and extract individual loan level pieces of information from your core system. There are also privacy issues with that. In order to trace a loan through time, you would have to have the loan number. So you would be able to say, okay, well, this loan originated on this date, and here's the history of that loan through time. You need to be able to connect that information. The only way to do that is with a loan number, and that might violate some privacy issues. So the other thing is you need to be able to explain your results. And when you get into lots and lots of loan detail, it can become difficult for managers of the organization, credit unions, to explain where the results are coming from to, say, their board of directors or management or even their examiners. So that's why we say that our recommendation is you start with summary information from the call report and work with that first. One, it's fast. You can do it quickly. It's accurate. There's nothing inaccurate about it. And you have access to it immediately. So that's a little bit about that. And one thing I'd like to go back to is maybe even the timeline of the implementation. We, as I mentioned, this has got to be implemented by January of 2023, and you need to have gone through these various considerations that I just mentioned, data considerations, in particular, and you need to be able to gather the data and assemble the model and things like that. Well, there are a few steps you have to go through in order to get to the point where we're actually doing the work. And kind of backing into that, if you have to be ready January 1st of 2023, you need to really be working with data that's ready to go by September 30th of 2022. And the reason for that is on day 2, really January 2nd of 2023, you have to start using this methodology. You can't be try to figure it out. It has to be implemented and going. Most organizations are also going to be required by their examiners to go through a period of parallel processing. So they're going to have to do both CECL reserves and the current reserve that the methodologies that they're using now, and compare the two and see what the different results are. Kind of a little bit of irony here. As we've worked with clients, we found that most of the organizations we're working with are actually over reserved for CECL right now. In other words, they're reserving probably at 1% of loans, and that seems to be higher than what is necessary for CECL. I'm not saying that in every case, but we're seeing quite a bit of that. But they should be running parallel processing for at least, I don't know, 6 months to a year. Well, if you back off of that, in order to start parallel processing, you should have some sort of framework in place for your policies, your procedures, how you're going to use it, and everything else. So how do you actually use it without those kinds of things in place? So that kind of brings us back 6 months to a year prior to that, which is maybe roughly a year from now. But in order to get to that point, you have to have selected your methodology, gotten the data, figured out what vendor you're going to work with, and everything else. And that could take some time as well. What it's really kind of leading to is that you should be looking right now for the organization you're going to use in order to implement CECL. If you need software to do that, you need to be making that decision, or at least doing the evaluation now.
What are some things financial institutions should be looking for when selecting a CECL vendor?
A few obvious things, I would say. One is, do they have experience with financial institutions? Because a loan product is different than a physical product. So a lot of ALM vendors have intimate knowledge of loans and loan losses and return and things like that, and modeling loan information. So organizations that have ALM systems, organizations that understand accounting for financial institutions, and organizations that are flexible enough to allow you to start, I think, simple and then build complexity if you need that. Remember, you do have to be able to explain these results and your methodologies and justify them with your board and examiners. And if you start out with a really complex model right away, that might not be very comfortable for you when you have those kinds of conversations. So, yeah, we think that working with organizations that already have intimate understanding of loans and loan losses and things like that would be an important consideration.
Could you talk a little bit about Nexoft CECL solution and how it differs from other competitor solutions?
The one thing we've started with, frankly, is the aggregate model, the one that uses call report data. And there are a couple of advantages to that. One, I've already mentioned, the data. We have it available and we can produce it. In fact, if a bank or credit union calls me today, all I need is their FDIC or their NCUA number to look up their call report, download it, and load it into our model. Another advantage to that is, since we're dealing with call data, that means I can also pull information from other credit unions and banks and do a peer comparison. A lot of organizations, part of CECL is you need to start with a base loss rate, and that base loss rate is going to come from a historical evaluation of your own balance sheet. Now, that's not to say that whatever happened in the past you're going to carry forward and use as a loss rate. So what we do is we download all the information from the call report. We download 10 years, or actually more like 12 years of history, and we slice that data up into various time slots. And so we look at a rate over all time, and we also look at loss rates over the average life of the various categories within a call report. So as an example, a 1 to 4 family first mortgage might have an average life of 22 quarters. We say quarters because we're dealing in call report data, and that's a quarterly filing. So we'll look at the loss rate over 22 quarters versus all time, and we'll compare the two. And then we'll also look at the peer information during the same time period. So the peers can be anything, typically within the same state and around the same asset size. We try to do it geographically because we know that organizations are going to experience different loss rates throughout the country based upon their location. So we're able to compare peers to the subject bank and then decide, are we going to adjust the subject bank loss rates based upon what the peer information is telling us? We're not saying you have to match exactly, but maybe we just kind of adjust towards it. We weight the loss rates to be more reflective of what the group of banks and credit unions are experiencing in their geographic location. In the end, then, there's also an adjustment using Q factors, which is something that an organization, any organization, should already be familiar with. It's kind of that subjective questionnaire of things such as, have your loan practices changed? Have your policies changed? Is there a significant change in the personnel involved in your lending practices? Are there economic situations occurring either regionally or globally that are impacting your lending? And so we want to assign some value to that. We can answer these very subjective questions and then turn those into a number that helps adjust to a final CECL loss rate. We apply that then to your current balances, and that's going to give us a loss rate on a loan category basis. Those loss rates are going to be used going forward during your lending. So if you calculate 2% for that particular category, every time you make a loan that would ultimately end up in that category in the call report, you're going to have to reserve 2%. 2% is high, but that might be, that's just an example.
My last question is a fun one. If you could have dinner with anyone, living or dead, who would it be and why?
Have dinner with it? Oh gosh. Well, I suppose it would have to be somebody who's in the culinary arts. So I would say Gordon Ramsay, because my wife and I have eaten at one of his restaurants, the one at Claridge's in London, and it was a pretty amazing experience. So I like people like that, because I think when you have a dinner with someone like that, you're going to get the story behind everything. You're not just going to get a plate of food put in front of you. Now, that's not to say I go out and seek out these kinds of expensive dinners. I just find it interesting to learn about how things are assembled and put together and whatnot. So, I'm sure I'd just have a lot of questions for, how do you coordinate so many different people in a kitchen to put all this together in one piece and have it come out so perfect? So I'd say, yeah, Gordon Ramsay would be a good one.
Well, thank you, Tom, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Amy. I appreciate it.
For more information about Nexoft CECL solutions and to learn about what you need to do before January 2023, visit www.nexoft.com. Nexoft is hosting its very first virtual user conference. What's Next? A Look at the Future of Cybersecurity and FinTech is a half-day conference on September 17th. Mentalist Alan Chamo will be the keynote entertainer, and there will be plenty of opportunities for one-on-one networking, insightful sessions, and a virtual expo area. The first 200 attendees to register will receive a free gift bag from Nexoft. To learn more and to register to attend, visit www.nexoft.com. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of OmniTalk. As always, stay safe and stay well.